Two. Two. Hey. 4, 5, 6. 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Lunch. We'll get straight back into the conference. We are running 5 minutes behind. So up next, we've got Emma Wilkinson.
are they focusing on asbestos so much? What an inspector will ask you about, and then crucially for you all as business owners, where can you go for advice and support with your asbestos duties? And the reason I've been asked to come and speak to you today is because I'm a gamekeeper turned poacher now. I used to be an HSE inspector in the construction division, so had a lot of things to do with asbestos during my time. But health and safety has been part of my whole career from way back in the year 2000 when I started teaching. I was a science and engineering teacher. I've taught in some physics labs that were entirely made of asbestos, where you couldn't even put drawing pins in the wall, and if a naughty kid kicked the wall and made a hole, then everyone had to leave. I also worked at a 100-year-old hangar at Boscombe Down, where again there was asbestos in the walls and absolutely all sorts of stuff. So, but it wasn't really until I started working for HSE that I really understood the scale of the issue with asbestos, and the reason why HSE consider it to be so harmful and such a high-risk material to deal with. And I won't hesitate on these statistics for too long, because I think this morning has served as really valuable context to everything that we're doing. But asbestos is continuing to make many people very ill indeed, and is still continuing to kill people. And people should not be injured or killed or made ill by their work. It's not something that should be happening in the modern day. And crucially for businesses, the impact of things like this is also massive. So outside of the human cost, there is a cost in working days that are lost. There's a cost in what they call the never returns. So people that withdraw from the workplace due to injury or illness and never return. And therefore, there is a cost to the economy, both in terms of cost to business and to the government and the social infrastructure of the NHS and the benefit system, but also to individuals, because it is still the individual that bears the majority of the burden when it comes to workplace illness, and asbestos illnesses are no different. If you've ever sat a managing safely course, these are IOSH's 3 reasons for managing health and safety effectively, and I think we've really covered the range of these today. But also risk management is all about the creation and protection of value. And what HSE want businesses to do, and what is good for business to do, is to front load your efforts into the prevention space and also generate evidence of what you are doing to manage the risk from asbestos. Because some companies are doing their best, they are doing the right thing, but they may be unable to evidence that they are doing that, and they're unable to evidence how close they are to the benchmarks. And for those of you that have ISO certifications, ISO view risk as the effect of uncertainty on your objectives. And if your objectives are to run a successful and profitable business and retain talented staff, then failing to manage health risks, including asbestos, is not very good business sense. So, what will an inspector ask you about? The first thing to recognise is that there are 4 categories of inspection regarding asbestos. So, the management of asbestos in premises. This is the focus of HSE's most recent campaign, the Your Duty Asbestos Your Duty campaign. So for those people who own premises, that's one inspection that can be done. The second one is the majority of construction activities in buildings that are older than the year 2000 is the non-licensed asbestos work. And then we've got the notifiable non-licensed and the licensed. And for those of you who are working to remove or manage and encapsulate asbestos, it's important to recognise that the definition of a construction activity in CDM is absolutely massive. If you go to L153 and read the definition of a construction activity, it's 4 paragraphs. So it's not just knocking down walls and building new things. It's also things like maintenance activities, inspection activities, even some cleaning, painting, decorating. So if you've got asbestos in your building, or if you don't know if you've got asbestos in your building, and somebody's coming to drill holes to put new internet in there, then you need to know if you've got some, because if you have, you need to tell the contractors. So we're not just thinking about the control of asbestos regs, we're also thinking about the construction regs as well. Okay, so HSE and the kind of regulatory background in this country is designed to be proactive. And what that means is that the offences in health and safety cases are for the creation of risk. So yes, companies may be prosecuted for killing people or injuring them or giving them a terrible disease. But that isn't the reason why they have been prosecuted. It's about that creation of risk. And that is why proactive prosecutions happen regarding asbestos so often, because if you've had an uncontrolled spread or you've had people doing a work activity that could expose them and you don't know if they are or not, it's that creation of risk that is the offence. And like with everything else, HSE try to take a risk-based approach to enforcing on asbestos. So this is their consideration of why asbestos is a risk from their own internal enforcement guidance, which was mentioned earlier. So they are looking at the risk of somebody developing a serious health effect, which is irreversible, disabling, and often fatal. And that is where they're beginning with. So that, in terms of your risk equals likelihood multiplied by consequences, this is the consequences they are considering. Following on from that, they look at the likelihood. And again, in their enforcement guidance, it talks about the factors that can affect that. Bearing in mind that we know some people are going to be more susceptible because of genetics and lifestyle and so on. So we know that there's not a straight causation, correlation, relationship, but thinking about the type of asbestos people have been exposed to, the age when they're first exposed, so considering those people who are in schools with poorly managed asbestos, the quantity of fibres breathed in and the duration and frequency are all factors that they take into account. And then during an inspection, they will be looking for evidence to help them to understand the quality of asbestos management on site, whether that be by a specialist subcontractor, whether it be by a principal contractor, or additionally by the principal contractor, and also by the client, who should reasonably have the information in their possession to tell all of their contractors, we've got some asbestos, this is where it is, and this is what type it is. And then those contractors that are going to go on to do destructive work then know that they need to get a refurbishment and demolition survey. HSE are primarily looking to see whether the asbestos has been identified and removed, or if not, that it's been managed to prevent or reduce exposure to everyone that might be affected. So not just employees, but contractors, delivery drivers, visitors, members of the public, and unauthorised people, intruders, okay? Just like pretty much everything else in construction and health and safety, it's all those groups of people. So what do the inspectors use for their benchmarks? There's a number of things that they will bear in mind and look at. So they will look at L143, which is the approved code of practice for the asbestos regs. They will also look at their own website, so the Asbestos Essentials sheets for various different activities and industries will give the inspector an idea of what the commonly accepted control measures are and what good looks like in a particular industry or activity. They will also look at what level of training people have got on site. They will be looking at whether the owner of the site or person in control of the site is fulfilling their duty to manage. And they will also look at the enforcement guidance. And links to all of these things are included at the end of my presentation. So the first priority in the law is the prevention of exposure. So that's the first thing that the inspector is going to be looking at when they arrive on your site. And if it's not reasonably practicable to do that, and often you can have a conversation about what is reasonably practicable in your circumstances and context. But then if we're not preventing the exposure, we've got to be able to evidence what we are doing to get that exposure down to the lowest level possible. They will be looking that the employer has chosen the most effective method or combination of methods to not only minimise fibre release but also reduce exposure below the control limit. And in addition to that, suitable RPE needs to be worn. It's very context dependent, and data and knowledge are your friend when you are deciding upon control measures. In my team in Nottingham, we had to go to some old separate garage buildings, so a load of houses, and then they all had garages all joined together in one place. And there was a guy on top of those garages merrily pressure washing the asbestos roof to clean it because he didn't like how it looked from his bedroom window. And so that gentleman was not only exposing himself but everybody in the neighbourhood, and had definitely not recognised the risk and not taken any measures to protect anyone from exposure at all. So what that means is that when we're looking at benchmarking, not only was that guy, that duty holder, really far away from that benchmark, but they were also exposing multiple people to a risk of serious illness. And that is the benchmark that HSE will be looking at. And there's just some examples on over there of things that they will be looking at. And I'm talking at the moment about not licensed removal work, but kind of typical construction activities that may uncover asbestos. So HSE are looking to determine two things. Are there any matters of evident concern present? So these are things that HSE consider pose an imminent risk of harm, whether that's falling off of something or whether that is getting a serious health effect or serious exposure. And those matters of evident concern, that's your prohibition notice territory. So these are activities that need to be stopped, that cannot be allowed to continue. So man pressure washing asbestos, definite PN territory. And they will also be looking at other risks that are still high consequence events but much less immediate in terms of their effects. And those scenarios might result in a formal letter, so a notification of contravention, or an improvement notice to require a duty holder to take action. And where HSE do encounter PN territory with respect to asbestos, they will also be considering prosecution. So in the enforcement guidance, it clearly states that. And so HSE will then be asking questions and essentially gathering evidence to demonstrate this breach of the law is serious enough to warrant a prosecution. So again, your systems, your management systems that you have are vital for answering the inspector's questions. if you're unable to answer a question, so for example, have you got an asbestos survey at all? Have you got an R&D survey if people are hitting down walls? Then the site manager saying, well, I think there is one, and I'm pretty sure they told me that there was no asbestos here, and we wouldn't have started work if there was. That's not really any evidence at all that you know if there is asbestos present. And what that means is that the inspector will consider a prohibition notice to stop all work until an R&D survey is provided. At the very least, they are going to write to your company, okay? Moving on from there, anything that can realistically cause multiple injuries or multiple cases of illness, those are the things that they will be writing to you about. Some examples of matters of evident concern are anything with potential for significant fibre release. So if you don't have a survey, so we've got no evidence to tell us if there's asbestos here or not, if the building is pre-2000, then that is needed. It's not a nice-to-have thing. The client must have a management survey. And so when they engage you to do the work, that is pre-construction information that they can reasonably provide to you, that they are expected to do so. And let's not forget that massive definition of construction work. So whoever comes in to do the survey is doing a construction activity. And so when the lady earlier was talking about welfare and all of that stuff, the whole of the construction phase, those things need to be provided. And as principal contractors and contractors, you can be more demanding of the people that are buying your services. And in actual fact, they may expect you to be demanding of them and may thank you if you're alerting them to a potential problem that they don't even know they've got. Other examples, unsuitable methods of work, things that will disturb asbestos-containing materials, so any kind of energetic work, especially if workers are meant to be in an area where there is no asbestos, and then the job magically grows, which often happens. The scope of work will expand, and what we need to make sure is that the guys on the ground know. If the client says, or the principal contractor says, can you just do X? If it's not on your agreed work, then you need to stop and wait and ask. And everybody has duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act, including workers. Everyone on a construction site has duties under CDM, including the workers, to take care of themselves and everybody else. We need to be setting people up for success so that if they want to say no to some work, that we are supporting them in doing that when it's for safety. Other things, spread related, so if we, for example, are removing asbestos cement sheets, we're supposed to be removing them in one piece, and actually somebody's decided it will go faster if we smack them with hammers first, then that is not a suitable work method for that activity. So I think this is fairly self-explanatory. And you guys are all the experts in what you do. That is not HSE's role to be the expert in what you do, but what they are the experts in is what the law requires. And it's very black and white in the health and safety sector. It's a bit like speeding. Either you were speeding or you weren't. And if you were, there is no scope for that you had a good reason, it was an emergency, you didn't know what the speed limit was. The offence is you did the thing. And it's the same with all of the health and safety regulations. There's not very much room for grey areas whatsoever. So I got an example prosecution just to demonstrate to you the kind of process that HSE go through. And I didn't pick this one with any kind of agenda at all. I just went onto the prosecution page, press release page, searched for asbestos ones, and picked the most recent one. So this is a case where HSE visited some premises and found uncontrolled spread of asbestos around much of the premises. And on further investigation, they were actually there because workers had complained about unsafe work at height. So it is crucial for you all that you are fully risk assessing all of your activities, that you are coming up with safe systems of work and methods of work, that you are communicating those effectively to workers and supervising them, monitoring them. Not through binoculars 100% of the time, but every so often satisfying yourself that your workers are working the way you've asked them to, or that contractors are working the way that they've told you they will. And it's equally as important with asbestos as it is for everything else. Because once an inspector has been brought to your site, they will have their eyes across everything. So it wasn't an asbestos concern that brought them to this place, but it rapidly became one. So they found significant debris associated with the breakage of asbestos cement sheet roof sheets. That was almost good English there, well done. And they'd taken down a unit that had an estimated 100 square metres of AIB, 70% of which was smashed apart by hand and by machine. So you can imagine the state of the place. And often in cases like this, the inspector won't even get across the doorway. Inspectors are trained really clearly. When you get to site, how old is the building? If they're doing destructive work, that's your first question. Your second question is, where is the asbestos survey? And if they haven't got one, you don't go in there and you get everybody else out. And that is it. That is the briefing. So, subsequent investigation found out that the work was done under the direct control of a company director who was fully aware of the dangers posed by asbestos, because he did get a qualified person to do a survey and then disregarded that survey and continued to encourage his workers to work in a way that was not safe. So just like with other things in health and safety, Section 37 of the Act gives directors specific duties alongside their company. And if a company is going to be prosecuted, a director can then be prosecuted alongside. And the Section 37 considerations are consent, neglect, or connivance. So in this case, consent. He actively knew what was going on, actively knew the issues, and encouraged work to continue. If he was the kind of director that sits in his office like this, with his eyes closed, that's neglectful. If there are things going on under their control that they should have known about, even if they didn't, that is neglect. So if you're a company director and your company does intrusive work in a building older than the year 2000, then you are expected to know that there is a risk from asbestos and manage that. What was the other one? Connivance. So if we're doing things in secret, or the only company that I'm going to name today, and only because HSE named them in quite an unusual move for them, a few years ago there was a company called Asbestos Boss, and HSE took the really unusual step of basically naming them publicly because they were doing licensed removal work without a license, but they were charging homeowners for the licensed premium. They said that they had a waste transfer license to move asbestos around. They did not have that, but charged the clients that premium. They also said that they had a licensed place to dispose of said asbestos, which ended up being fly tipped in the countryside. And they left that customer's house and home incredibly contaminated. So, you know, that's perfect example of connivance, I suppose. Okay, so the company was fined 20k. The fines are proportionate to the turnover of a company. Turnover and profitability are not the same, and I know that some business owners find this to be quite mean, but it's meant to be a punishment and it's meant to be a deterrent. So it will be proportionate to your turnover, and individuals are fined in proportion to their weekly income, and it's usually between 300 and 700% of their weekly income. So again, it's not small amounts that we're talking about. And then the inspector and the judge basically went to town in their final statements about the conduct of this company. And that's just one example. In the asbestos industry, there are many, and in the wider construction industry, there are even more. So, I'm not the kind of consultant that threatens people with judges and prosecution and prison. There is a long road between what happens on site and winding up in a courtroom. It's never a surprise. Often people talk to me quite frightened, like, "Oh my God, they're not going to visit you on Friday and have you in front of a judge on Monday. It's not going to be a surprise. During the investigation process, you will get the opportunity to put forward your evidence of what you are doing to control the risk. And being able to do that is what is going to reduce the likelihood of being prosecuted. Inspectors will always be looking for the gap between the benchmarks and what the law is asking for and the situation that exists on site. And so the more that you can evidence what you are doing, the less serious the enforcement action will be. So they might need to write to you because you are in breach of the law, but if you've done everything that they could expect you to do, then the enforcement action won't need to go further than that, unless, of course, despite your best efforts, people have been seriously exposed, and then they'll still be thinking about prosecution, because that's how serious they find it to be. Okay, really quickly, where can you go for guidance? Because it's a lot. There's a lot to keep track of. So, first place, L143, approved code of practice. It's still an approved code of practice for the asbestos regs. Approved codes of practice are special because they tell you how to comply with the law. So if you do what the bold text tells you, you will be complying with the law. You don't have to do it, but whatever you do instead needs to be equally as effective. The document for CDM, L153, used to be an ACOP, it's not anymore. But it is still packed full of guidance. Everyone inside HSE calls it an ACOP, even though it isn't anymore. And again, the guidance is one way of complying with the law. And again, you don't have to follow it, but what you do instead needs to be equally as effective. And anything in the law that is qualified with so far as reasonably practicable, that flips the burden of proof onto you if you are prosecuted. So HSE don't have to prove a negative, you have to prove what you did do, okay? Other things, so that is the link to the enforcement guidance that's still active for asbestos. It's got all sorts of stuff in there. It's got their enforcement management model, the way that they make decisions. It's got the things that they're encouraging inspectors to look for. It's got the suggested enforcement that they think inspectors should take. So, for example, the one about construction says, if any part of Schedule 2 is missing, write them improvement notice. So even if the only thing you're missing is hot water, you might get a notice from especially if it's a new inspector who's following that guidance like a railway line. Asbestos Essentials, there's also a section on training. There's a big campaign about the duty to manage. There's also loads of info for licensed contractors. And crucially, for your awareness training and for having around casually on the table in the welfare are some pictures and images of typical places where asbestos might be. There's also a big campaign going on. So again, these links are all in my slides for you to have. And that is me done. Thanks very much.
Before the speakers from today come onto the stage, please. We're now going to be taking questions from the audience. I'm hoping there's lots. We've got about half an hour for questions. So if you could just raise your hand if you have got a question, and if you could give your name and who the question's for, please, and a microphone will find you.
Oh, thank you.
Any questions? Please.
Emma. Emma, thank you much for that, but I noticed one thing that wasn't mentioned at all about the asbestos was about the asbestos management plan. That is a big thing, and I know it's a big thing in the EMM, table 1, but I think it's very hard to get the client to understand what their responsibilities are. What's your action on that?
So there is, on the new duty to manage pages, there are example templates of a management plan and an asbestos register. So I would provide those to clients as a contractor or consultant, and encourage them to add that to their risk management process. So they can then use that template. So it's not hard for them to do. It's easily implemented, and then it is the way that HSE want it to be automatically.
But if they refuse to accept that,
well, it's the age-old quandary of when do we sack our clients, because there's what you've got to contemplate as a contractor in construction work is one of your duties is to make sure the client knows what their duties are. It says it in every section, make sure the client knows what their duties are. For principal designers, there is a red, amber, green document that the CITB have put together that includes asbestos considerations in there. So the PDs in the pre-construction phase of projects needs to be talking about that. But outside of the construction kind of arena, your clients that own premises have a duty to manage their asbestos. And it is up to them how they want to evidence it. And their management plan can have any format, but they do need one. And if they don't have one, it only takes one person to put a concern into HSE, or for HSE to turn up for another matter, because they will ask.
I mean, it's just because they say we don't have to have one called asbestos management plan. We don't have to do this, and that's been my main concern for 5 years. But of course, they just say we don't have to have one, or we've got all these buildings and we can't, and we just haven't got the time to do one.
But if they haven't got a plan, they've got to manage the arrangements, because anybody who's likely to disturb asbestos is entitled to do it.
I know.
Yeah. And they don't have to call it an asbestos management plan. It can be whatever they want to call it. But
they have a document that's not called it, but they keep referring to the asbestos management plan when you say, where is it?
as long as they can put a document in an inspector's hand when they ask for it, that's all. It doesn't have to be called that. It can be whatever format that they want it to be in, as long as it has got, yes, we've got it, this is where it is, this is the condition, this is what we're doing to keep an eye on it. This is the awareness training we've given people in the building, so they know if they see suspicious piles of dust underneath our clad wall, that they need to back off and report that. So it's the system rather than what it's called or what it looks like. So HSE, unless the law is really prescriptive, they can't tell you how to manage it, just that you need to, and that there are certain activities that are part of that. So however, whatever system they want, as long as it meets the requirements, it can look a multitude of ways.
Presumably, Emma, it could be re-inspection, because you could have the snapshot from the survey done, and then you've got re-inspections to record that.
So I would, in a regular building, include looking at my asbestos as part of my weekly, monthly, quarterly walk rounds. Depending how likely it is someone's going to drive into it with a forklift truck and crack it in half. You know, if it's under the floor or in the ceiling, then we don't have to keep an eye on it as often, but we do need to say to people at Christmas time, please don't lift up the ceiling tiles to hang decorations, because that might be bad. So it's designed to be non-specific enough that it can be proportionate to everybody's circumstances and context, but then it makes it really hard to like force people to do stuff, which, you know, as a consultant without a warrant is not my favourite thing.
There's a dynamic, isn't there, between education and understanding and enforcement.
Yes.
You can't have one without the other.
No, you can't.
On that same theme, the HSE, do you know if HSE is still taking HSU 227 as current live guidance for clients? Was that something on my wayside to say?
If it still exists on the website and it hasn't been withdrawn, then yes, it can be relevant. And with a lot of the HSGs and the INDGs that are more topic-specific or scenario-specific guidance, they only look at those actively when there is an issue. So, for example, the health and safety in roof work one only becomes an issue if you're enforcing reasonable measures for roof work. So anything in the asbestos essentials and the asbestos essentials that are flavoured for different industries are applicable, but will only come up in conversation, I suppose, if there's a problem. And HSE go, well, this is the benchmark, and it's this document or this example.
Any more questions?
I've got one pretty long. If on the 0.001 fibres per centimetre cube, 1,000 fibres per cubic metre, I remember back in the 80s we had 2 fibres per centimetre cube, which is 2,000 times higher. I wonder how it's going to work out in the future. But in the UK, and you talked about the European Asbestos Worker Directive, and we have the Control of Asbestos regulations, which changed from the Control of Asbestos at Work regs. But my question on this is, you referred to Sevens, and when I've sent stuff off to Sevens, it's taken 10 days to get this done. And I'm thinking, you're going to put a cell in your boots. I don't know, but how is it going to work? And one of the things that I was thinking about is Emma, this lady here, Emma. How it works in relation to the UK. We've got 2 Emmas, Paul. Yeah, I get it. So how's it going to fit? In other words, do you see it extrapolating and coming down even more? Or do we rely, as we do in the UK, more on visual inspections rather than air tests? Because visual inspections are more important, I feel, than just the test. The test validates the inspection.
Your question does touch on quite a number of aspects, Wayne, and which is exactly what I wanted to say. I'll pick a few and I'll be here the rest of the day, and of course, you and everybody else here can always contact me easily on LinkedIn. I think that's what you spoke about was yesterday or the day before, the topic of a debate on LinkedIn, actually. It might be Tom Laubenthal's Asbestos Professionals Network. And it touched on that, actually, and the discussion was, and somebody asked me, well, how do you feel about PCM? And I made a joke and said, well, isn't that really out of the Stone Age or something like that? And forgive me, but it is. There are far more modern ways of microscopy out there. In Europe, we are seeing that certainly with the Green Deal drive and the renovation wave and all these policies of the European Union and Commission, that SEM is very much encouraged or even prescribed nowadays, which means that all the laboratories are buying the SEM microscopes, particularly, also TEM, but mostly SEM, like crazy. Indeed, I personally have an inkling that ITGA, which is the driving force behind asbestonomy, always puts a big stand with ITGA because it wants to promote the use of SEM microscopes. And big money there. You see, my own conference is very different in that regard. It's not meant to promote anything in particular. But with more SEM being available and more competition and more requests for SEM, also all these laboratories who already have SEM, they have waiting lines out the door and up the street. Sometimes even for weeks of work waiting on them, and they just can't find the staff to keep up with the demand. And so whoever does have the staff can offer it also cheaper and faster, and there is a really competitive market out there. And inevitably, if you want to distinguish yourself from your competitors, then you have to have the better stuff in your laboratory. That's how it works. I was speaking to Sean Fitzgerald only 2 nights ago, and he told me that he was buying a super duper super deluxe SEM microscope that weighed something like 20 tons, or an enormous amount if I remember correctly, and he was going to drive a really big truck 12 hours across the United States, and he said, this makes the finest photos that I have ever seen. I had to have this. But that's the distinctive part, basically. How do you prove that there is asbestos? By having better equipment than your competitors, by being able to do it faster, by being able to do it more affordably for your clients. There is a very big demand. It's only going to grow. And I imagine the price of SEM microscopy is, the microscopes themselves might go up, but the prices of the service are likely in the next few years to go down considerably. Yeah. Has that answered some aspects of your question?
Yeah. Practically, I think what happens in Europe will happen here, but I think we just have a slightly different approach in the UK in relation to visual inspections, more importantly. You can get a test to pass, but visually you can't hide stuff that's there, you can see it.
Isn't it really strange to do a visual test for something that you can't even see with the naked eye?
No, but you can see the material that should have been removed and how well it's been removed and debris that's been left. And that's what we have, but that's what we have, we put the emphasis on. Emma, is that not the way that we kind of improve the 4-stage clearance for HSG248?
I'm not an expert in the licensed removal process. All the HSE do when they do licensed inspections is to check that the measures that are in the ACOP are actually there and done. I think HSE are always much more keen on not creating spread of fibres in the first place. So if the process of work is not energetic, or there's a lot of damping down, or however it is accomplished, then the air tests are a final kind of guarantee of safety, but actually that doesn't give you license to just create an enclosure full of fibres and then clear them out and wait for them to settle or ventilate out later. They're much more keen that in the first place that isn't created. So, there's always a tension when you've got to have particular tests done, and there's not a quick answer to that.
I think it's really good that we're encouraging greater standards.
Yeah.
I think it's really good. It's just that I was just comparing and contrasting the last 50 years. It's gone 2,000 times lower you know, what was acceptable then isn't acceptable now, and what's acceptable now may be acceptable tomorrow. Is it?
The thing is, of course, that innovation keeps up with the legislative drive. And if you have strict legislation, then there is a need for innovation to keep up with that. But just one remark, and then we'll go to the next question. In the Netherlands, for instance, we tend to prefer to actually do measurements and tests after a job has been delivered and send them off to a separate independent laboratory. And once they check it and say the facts are this falls within the legal requirements, then it is considered to be safe and all the particular interest of parties is taken out of the equation. And you can rely on facts and a legal defense rather than somebody who says, well, I think that, well, whoever that person is, or whatever his opinion is, and whatever his interests are, you have solid facts and a report that you can base your position on. Yeah.
Can I just add a comment into that? It's just an observation, and maybe it's going to put the cat among the pigeons. But I know last year at the EAF there was a lot of talk about the lowering of the occupational exposure standard because it was actually announced at the conference as well. But that gave the opportunity for us to have a lot of roundtable discussions. And although in the first instance we were all talking about the ability to monitor to that level, to be able to detect whether it was asbestos or not, so should we use electron microscopy, whereas the UK has always used optical microscopy, and what would the impact be if we not only introduced the requirements to reduce the occupational exposure standard, but also how we analyse. One thing that became sort of quite clear very, very quickly was we weren't actually comparing like for like. There was a lot of discussion on clearance testing, you know, whether or not asbestos had been removed correctly, where you've got, I suppose if you build it in, the luxury to send your samples off to get the results back. Whereas in the UK, we do a lot of leak testing. And if we're doing leak testing, we want a result that's quite quick because we're potentially exposing people that are on the outside of that removal enclosure. If we have to wait to send samples off, we are potentially exposing people. Whereas optical, my personal view, optical microscopy has got a place. I also think electron microscopy has as well. But I think it just became quite clear that although we're all trying to strive for the same end result, we're not always sort of talking about the same thing. So I think it is important just to sort of not lose sight of that as well.
Thanks, Colette. I've got one more question here.
Thank you, everybody. It's been enlightening today. We are coming to possibly the end of a government who have walked us towards deregulation. If you expect our enforcement agencies to get any better, it's not going to happen. Why have we not got a proper guidance note for welfare? Because there's no money in the kitty to do it. Because they have to have a building safety regulator because we've allowed people to burn to death in a tower block. Why have we got no proper ACOP for the construction industry? Because we were told we have to deregulate this because there was too much information out there. It's not going to go backwards without it's going to go backwards without pressure from industry. We have to keep pushing this forwards. Okay, because they're not going to do it without being forced to do it. It's a terrible thing to say, but nobody cares, I'm afraid, about your friend who passed away in government. They don't care. It's just a number. We have to put pressure on it, whether that's in terms of financial pressure, whatever it is, we have to do that. I do have a question rather than a statement, so sorry. I wanted to ask Graham. You mentioned that your environmental license, your lease is coming to an end. Yeah. Does that mean you're not accepting any materials at the moment?
Yeah, no, we're not accepting material at the moment. But as I say, we've really validated everything we wanted to validate with the demonstration plant. So although we've still got a permit for the site in Wolverhampton, and the landlord would allow us to open a full-scale plant up there, we'd need to vary our permit because we need more storage and we need more space, and that would take time. So there wasn't really anything more to learn from operating the demonstration plant.
I guess economically it makes sense to have your plant as close as the tip is. Because if I've got to drive from where I am to Wolverhampton, or I can go to, Pindons.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the aim would be to have a network of plants around the country. I mean, there aren't many landfill sites anymore where you can actually take asbestos. So, once we've got the first one up, then the others hopefully could follow quite quickly. Thanks.
Very enlightening. My question is, got the hang of it now, maybe. My question is for Emma. And first of all, I also want to say I think the HSE has done a really good job on its duty to manage, and the information that you're putting out, I think, is overdue but really, really good. But my observation, and I'm curious to know what your observation is, when you go onto site, in your experience, how often do people actually have the right information, and how good a condition is it actually in for the people who need to understand it, the layman, shall we say, for them to have a reasonably good chance of actually not screwing it all up?
So I'm not in HSE anymore, so I'm allowed to have an opinion now that
Great.
I'm no longer bound by the Civil Service Code, which during period of time is amazing. The issue with flow of information to the layperson at the moment is that HSE do not have the budget or the capacity to do any kind of large-scale public education campaigns like they used to 20, 30 years ago. As was touched upon, the political picture has been controlled by people that are not fans of regulation and would like the regulations that we do have to go away, which almost happened thanks to the sunsetting bill, but ROSPA swooped in and saved the day. So as far as getting information out to the layperson, I encourage everyone to join their local Safety Groups UK, to join your Working Well Together groups, which are a cognac venture between HSE and local businesses. I encourage you to put on safety and health awareness days to actively educate, hopefully without them realising it, your clients and contractors that you work with or work for, to spread the information out there. I think the Your Duty campaign has been a really good start to that because it is on many more people's radar now. But there was a parliamentary working party last year where they wanted to change our approach on asbestos from if you've got it, keep an eye on it, to if you've got it, you actively need to start getting rid of it. And they were going to go for it, and then at the last minute, the parliamentary working party said, actually, we're not gonna do that now. So there is a shift towards encouraging people to start removing rather than managing. But at the moment, there's not going to be any kind of regulatory push to support that.
And can I ask, connected with that, because one of the other recommendations was for a central asbestos register, and I'm still struggling to see why the HSE was not really terribly supportive of the idea of something that would mean that people could access digitally much more easily information that could be, let's face it, it's all the same information. standardised into a common format that people might reasonably understand. Because at the moment, as you said earlier, everyone gets bits of paper, different stuff in all sorts of formats. And how are you going to educate and inform people if you make it that hard, if we make it that hard?
Well, I think the issue that you've got with any kind of national register of anything is that it's incredibly unwieldy and difficult to manage and very expensive. And also, you can't force people to fill it in. So think about how many people are doing licensed removal work without a license. Think about how many non-registered gas engineers there are out there. You've got to think about what would the benefit of a central register be, as opposed to the building owner. You can ask them, and if they can't provide that information, then you can go to the regulator with it. I functionally don't think that having a centralised register would do anything. It's not a magic bullet, but that is only my own opinion. So,
and
other
not
opinions are
one to have a
available.
conversation here, but I think
Yeah.
a lot of those issues, they're all valid, and I'm going to be completely frank, and I say I think technologically completely and utterly out of date. Most of those questions could be answered simply and cheaply with today's technology, but that's another conversation, of course.
Hello? I've gone from... I always feel like I'm Terry Wogan if I'm holding this. You know, it's so big. Can I just want to put a wee bit of positivity on this. I have been really, really heartened in the past, I would say 4 months, with the site visits that we've been carrying out. So we have the term contract for looking after asbestos management in Tata Steel. And we also look after about 120 housing associations and their health and safety in Scotland. So it's a real mix, you know, from literally an organisation with 5 staff looking after properties right the way through to tomorrow I'm back on site in full furnace-proof gear. There will be no red high heels at all. But across, so it means that we get to see a real variety of different organisations, different companies, different approaches. And I think post-COVID, there was the great resignation where everybody wanted to change what they were doing. So fine. Then you had all the newbies in who don't know up from down. So fine, you deal with that. But actually, what we're seeing now is a lot of the upcoming health and safety professionals 12 months ago seriously didn't know anything. They had no life experience at all. And now they've had enough experience, because if you're a proper health and safety professional, you see a lot of poo quite quickly, don't you? So the learning curve is really steep. And I have been really heartened by individuals, by chief execs, by directors, by managers, starting to realise they have to cover their back, because ultimately they are responsible. Now, okay, the legislation might change. It's not going to stop the ambulance chasers. It's not going to stop people using social media. Social media is horrible, absolutely horrible. And it's your worst nightmare as an owner or a business person to do something wrong, because it'll be splattered all over the pages everywhere. Also, I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes. I've done quite a bit of work with the British Safety Council, and the lobbying that they do is quite impressive, actually, for health and safety issues throughout the UK. Would you agree with that, Em? Okay. But of course, you don't see it, because it's and unless you're involved in individual projects with them, you don't see what they're doing. So there is. Don't be completely disheartened. You know, we don't all need to emigrate to Chile today. You know, there is a lot going on behind the scenes, and I think we will see a big improvement in about the next year, irrespective of what politicians try to mess things up further.
Just for Graham, obviously fantastic technology. In the future, is that technology going to be able to take other products apart from cement?
You mean other types and forms?
Yeah, so your amphibols and your licensed products.
in theory, our technology will work for all types of asbestos, not just chrysotile. And also it should work on all forms, but on the fibrous asbestos, on the friable asbestos, obviously the handling of it's got, more difficult. We probably would need to contain it in the kiln. That would affect the economics. So in terms of the commercial viability of being able to accept the other forms of asbestos, then we need to do more work on that. But I think the next thing that we should do is to be able to accept all types of cement-bound asbestos, because although most of it's chrysotile, not all of it is, and some of it's mixed. So it would be we're thinking of, when we vary the permit for a full-scale plant, that we may try and get permission to accept the other types of cement-bound asbestos. But in the future, it's definitely something that we will be looking at.
Right, we'll leave it there. Thank you to our panel and our speakers today. Thank you very much. You've been brilliant. So I hope you've all enjoyed your day. I hope you've learnt something. I just wanted to say a big thank you to, obviously, the staff as well, the hotel, and most importantly, thank you to all of you for attending today. It's been a brilliant day. CPD certificates and a feedback form will be coming out probably next week. And there'll be some refreshments outside as well if you want to help yourself before you get off home. If not, have a safe journey home, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.